What's up, everybody, and welcome to Wednesday in the Word. Tonight we're going to be continuing our study in the book of James. So if you've got your Bibles, you've got your notebooks, you've got your family around with you, why don't you go ahead and open up to James chapter 1. Now, before I jump into tonight's lesson from James chapter 1, starting down at verse 9, let me just recap real quick the first part of the book of James that we've already discussed. So if you go back and you look at the beginning of James chapter 1, you'll see that James is talking to his readers about trials and tests in their life. Now, a couple of things I want to mention the past couple of weeks. We've talked about week number 1, you are going to experience trials and tests in your life. Now, as you probably know, hey, you're probably going through one right now. I think about several million people in the world are going through a huge trial and test right now, if not a couple billion people. So trials and tests should be expected in our lives, but in those trials, in those tests in your life, you should be looking to see how God is drawing you closer to Him, because that's the whole reason for these trials in our lives, is to draw us closer to God, to have us depend more on God today than we did yesterday. And so be looking for opportunities of spiritual growth in your trials. Now, you could face your trial and you could go one of two different ways. You could depend more on God or you could run from God. Don't let your trials chase you away from God. Let your trials bring you closer to God. So right now, let's jump into James chapter 1 and start reading at verse 9. Believers who are poor have something to boast about, for God has honored them, and those who are rich should boast that God has humbled them. They will fade away like a little flower in the field. The hot sun rises and the grass withers, the little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. In the same way, the rich will fade away with all of their achievements. Now, first of all, let's get this cleared off the table. James is not relating someone's relationship status with God to their financial status. James is not telling us, hey, you should try to be poor, or hey, you should try to be rich. He's just saying whatever financial state you find yourself in right now, there is still a way for you to work yourself through the trial that God has put in your life. And so first and foremost, I think that what James is trying to teach us in these few verses is this: be humble in your trial. Everybody can be humble. And James wants us to know, whatever trial you're facing in your life, whatever difficulty that is laid out in front of you, first of all, know that it's sent from God to draw you closer to Him. Second of all, trust God that He's going to give you the wisdom to get through that trial. And then third, be humble. Be humble in your trial. Humility is a very difficult character trait in our lives to maintain. It is so hard sometimes for us to be humble. And James says, in your trial, be humble. Now, why would James say that? Why would he commend us, or why would he ask us to be humble in our trial? So let's jump into verse 9 and see what it has to say. Believers who are poor have something to boast about, for God has honored them. Now, what does this mean when it says that believers who are poor are honored by God? Simply put, I think it's because believers who find themselves in that kind of financial situation have a tendency to be able to trust God a little bit more in their lives when they're faced with these kinds of situations. To be honest, I think it's because they can't depend on anybody else other than God. They have nobody else or no one else or no other thing in their life that they can have come in place of their trusting God. And so all they have is to trust God. Now understand, in this passage, in this time that James is talking about, poverty was absolutely on a different level than what poverty is today and when we think of poverty in the United States. When James is talking to believers in this passage and he's speaking to them about poverty, these believers had absolutely nothing. They were probably living on the streets, begging for food, had absolutely maybe no clothes or just rags for clothes. And so their dependence level on God was at its highest. they had nothing to depend on. And so when James is speaking to those believers who are poor, keep in mind that these people had nothing to depend on except God. And so their trust level in God was absolutely at its highest. And I believe that James is writing to a church that was very diverse in its economic standing. I think that there were some extremely rich people in James's church that he's writing to in this passage. And I believe that there are some extremely poor people in this church. And so James is talking to, and I think, both sets of people when he's saying this. Because as we read on in the book of James later on, James is talking to the people and he's saying, hey, listen, if a wealthy man comes into your church and you say, hey, sit over here in this place of honor, and a poor person comes into your church and you say, oh, sit over here on the floor out of the way so that way we can't see you, James is saying you should have absolutely no respect of persons in your life and you should treat both people equally the same. And so what I think James is doing here is he's flipping the mindset of the people at this church, and he's saying, hey, the poor have been honored by God, and he's trying to get the people at this church to understand these people matter too. Just because they're not in the same financial situation that you're in, these people matter too. And something that I wrote down, just because you're poor doesn't mean that you cannot be rich spiritually. And I think what James is trying to teach this church is this: your financial standing here on this earth has absolutely nothing to do with your spiritual standing before God. Because to be honest, when God sees us, when He looks at us as individuals, He's not looking at our bank accounts. He's not looking about seeing how many achievements we have in our lives. He's not looking to see how many awards we have in our lives. You know what God's looking at for us as believers when He sees us? He's looking and saying, how much do you love me today? How much do you trust me today? How close are you walking with me today? And so I think that James hits this verse 9 real quick in saying the poor are honored by God because he wants these believers to understand your financial status has absolutely nothing to do with your spiritual status before God. And James is saying to those who find themselves in a poor situation, just because you're poor doesn't mean you cannot be rich spiritually. The next verse, verse 10, James addresses the people who are rich or find themselves in a wealthy standing or situation in their lives. Verse 10 says this, and those who are rich should boast that God has humbled them. They will fade away like a little flower in the field. So remember, to the rich, James is talking to them in the context of being in the midst or in the middle of a trial or a trouble in their life, a difficult situation. And so James says, hey, listen, if you find yourself financially well off and you find yourself in the middle of a trial, thank God for that trial because of what it's going to teach you in your life. He says that the rich should boast that God has humbled them. Hey, listen, be thankful that God has placed you in this because it keeps you humble, because it's going to humble you. And remember, we should always be humble in our trials. It doesn't matter what financial state we find ourselves in our lives. We should all be humble in our trials. And so to the rich, James says, be boastful that God has decided to put this trial in your life. So why exactly should the rich be boastful or happy that God has humbled them and put them in this trial? Well, just because you're rich doesn't mean that you will have it all together spiritually. This is an opportunity for you to grow your faith in God, to grow your trust in God, to grow in your relationship with God. Remember, that's the whole purpose for the trials in our lives in the first place, is to draw us closer to God in our relationship with Him. So we should all be humble in our trials. And it doesn't matter what state we find ourselves in financially. Everybody can be humble in their trial. So right now I got a question that I want you guys to discuss there at home with your students, with your spouses, with your friends that maybe you're watching this on Facebook Live with, or whoever you find yourselves with in a group of people. Here's the first question. And when I ask this, I want you to pause the video and discuss this question. And then when you're done discussing it, come back and hit play and we'll continue the teaching. And so here's question number one. We've been talking about money, been talking about finances. And I think that I can safely say that this is one of the things that this passage is teaching us is money doesn't mean everything. And so here's question number one. What are some important things in life that money can't buy? There's no price tag on them. They're free. They're out there for us to get. Money can't buy them. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't obtain these things. What are some important things in life that money can't buy? Well, thank y'all for discussing that question. So let's continue on and let's put together now verse 9 and verse 10 and talk about the poor and the rich alike and what we can gather in this situation and how they face a trial in their lives. So the poor and the rich alike can experience a deep and real spiritual walk with God if they are both humble and fully relying on God for everything in their lives. So the rich and the poor alike, the poor and the rich alike, both can experience the same kind of relationship with God if they're both humble and they both fully trust God with everything. And you see, that's the great thing about our relationship with Jesus. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter your financial status. It doesn't matter about your social status. It doesn't matter how many followers you have on Facebook, how many followers you have on Instagram. None of that stuff matters to God because He looks at us with all of that stuff stripped away and sees who we are and how much we love Him and our walk with Him. And that's what God's concerned about. The things that concern us, the things that we look at and we're like, oh man, that person's wearing the right clothes, or they're saying the right things, or they're listening to the right kind of music, or they've got the right kind of phone, or they've got the right kind of house or car or friends, or man, they're really popular. None of that stuff matters to God. All the things that we look at and say, all that's important to us, none of that matters to God. If we're going to look at this situation, we're going to look at what James is trying to teach us here. Number one, he's teaching us that we can be humble in our trials, but we also need to trust God completely. And it doesn't matter who you are. You can still have that deep, real relationship with God. So what does it mean to be humble? That is a great question. And I'm not going to throw that at you guys and have you guys discuss it. But very simply put, the one way that I understand humility is this. Humility is not weakness. Humility is not being a doormat for somebody. Humility is not saying, you know what, whoever it is, I'm going to let them walk all over me and I'm going to let them have their way and I'm just going to back away and just keep my mouth shut and be quiet. Humility is and I've heard it described like this, humility is strength or power under control. When you look at a lion in the wilderness or a lion, when you look at a lion out in nature, that mother lion can go up to her little babies and pick them up in her mouth and move them from place to place very gently. And at the same time, she can go out and with that same mouth, as she chases down her prey and kills it, she uses that same mouth with all of its strength to kill the prey that she's chasing, to tear the meat off of that prey, to take it back to those same cubs that she was picking up with the same mouth earlier in the day and feed them. It's that strength, that power, but it's still under control. And I think that what humility is to us is, you know what, we might be able to say something to somebody else, we're gonna back off because we know, hey, that might hurt their feelings, or that might not be the right thing to say at this point in time. We may be able to go out and do something with other people, but we say, you know what, I just don't need to do that right now. And if you want a true picture of what real, genuine humility is, look at the life of Jesus and follow his pattern. Because number one, Jesus was God, come to this earth to live among us. And how did he choose to come into this world? Did he come as a prince to be worshiped and followed after and listened to and obeyed? No, he came as a carpenter. He came as one of us, one of the common people. He chose to step down to be like us. And he didn't look at anybody else and say, you know what, I'm better than that, or I'm better than this person. There's no way I'm gonna go hang out with the lepers or the tax collectors or the notorious sinners. Jesus wasn't too good for anybody. And so I think that all of those things kind of combine together to show us what real humility is in our lives and how we can be humble. Listen, don't think that you're better than somebody else. Don't think that just because you are who you are, that those different things can't happen to you, because you know what? God could place any trial in any of our lives at any point in time, and then that would be a true humbling situation in our lives. So what I want y'all to do right now is I want you to pause this video and discuss this question. How can I be humble? And parents, if your students maybe are having a little bit of a difficult time understanding what it means to be humble, maybe this is also a good opportunity for y'all to discuss what humility means. So discuss what humility means if you need to, and also discuss the question, how can I be humble? Well, thank y'all for discussing those questions. Now let's look at verse 11. The hot sun rises and grass withers, the little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. In the same way, the rich will fade away with all of their achievements. In this last verse, I don't think that James is pointing out the rich specifically. I think what James is telling us in this verse very simply is nothing in this life lasts forever. We can try and gather as much stuff as we possibly can, but it's not going to last forever. Nothing in life lasts forever. Think about it. We all have stuff that we lose. We all have stuff that breaks. We all have things that wear out. Nothing in life lasts forever. Electronic equipment is going to break. Your TV is going to wear out. Your iPad, your phone, all that stuff one day, the battery's going to go dead on it, or it's going to break. You're going to crack the screen, or there's going to be a newer one out and the old one's not running as good. Your computers, they're going to wear out. Hey, listen, your clothes, you're going to get holes in them, and I know that that's probably the cool thing right now for the kids is to wear jeans with holes in them, but listen, their jeans are going to wear out, t-shirts are going to get dirty, they're going to get stains. Everything in life is going to fail, wear out. Nothing in life lasts forever, except for one thing. Haha, there's one thing that lasts forever. Any guesses? People's souls last forever. People last forever. That's the one thing in this life that's going to last forever. And so if you're going to invest in something, I think this is a great lesson for all of us, and this goes along with in your trial, be humble, because when you're humble, you have an opportunity to invest in other people's lives. If you're going to invest in something, invest in the lives of other people, because that's the only thing that's going to last forever. As James goes through this passage, he's trying to teach us, listen, everything's going to fail. Everything's going to wear out. The rich may not be rich forever. The poor may not be poor forever. Nothing in this life lasts forever except for people. And so right now we're in a huge trial across the world. Global epidemic, coronavirus. Woo-hoo, stay at home, social distancing. How are you investing in people's lives through this trial? How are you sharing your faith with other people? How are you being an example of a follower of what it means to be a follower of Jesus to your neighbors, and how they see you handling this situation? How they see you teaching your kids school from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., if it lasts that long. Investing in the lives of people is what really matters. That's the only thing that we can carry with us into eternity, is people. People are going to last forever. Their souls are going to live forever in one of two places. Who are you taking with you? Whose lives are you investing in? Who are you sharing Jesus with? Who are you being an example to in your life right now? So here's the question that I want to ask you guys, and we'll pause the video when I ask this question. How can you invest in people's lives for eternity? We all have different gifts. We all have different talents. We all have different ways that we can reach out to people. We all have different people in our lives. So how can you invest in the lives of other people? So go ahead and pause that video right now and discuss that question. Hey, so I want to say thanks for watching this week. Remember, be humble in your trial. We all have an opportunity right now to live that out in our lives, being humble in our trial. Listen, we're no better than anybody else. God may have blessed us with resources that we can use to help somebody else. Don't think that you're too good to help somebody in need. Be humble in your trial. Be like Jesus in your trial. And whose lives are you investing in today? Hey, listen, thanks for watching this week. We'll be right back here next week for Wednesday in the Word, and we're going to continue to talk and go through the book of James. So if y'all want to go ahead and read ahead and kind of maybe get into your mind what we're going to be reading next week, we're going to start James chapter 1, verse 12, and go down through verse 15. So James 1:12 down through humility. James 1:12 down through verse 15. And I'll see y'all next week.